For years, people have been under the influence that dedicated photo and video cameras were better at taking video and photos than a cell phone. And I think that's kind of changed in the last couple years in that some of the cell phone video has gotten a little bit better. And now a lot of people believe that a cell phone can take just as good of photos and video as a dedicated camera. And so in today's video, I wanted to prove why a cell phone photo will never take as good of photos as a dedicated photo video camera. It is physically impossible. And I don't mean that by the saying physically impossible. I mean that by the science of physics. It's physically impossible. Now, this all comes down to size, mostly. One of the key design elements of a smartphone is that it's really small and easy to carry around. And that's actually the opposite of what you want in order to take a good photo, because you actually want, in some ways, as big as you can go. The first way this plays out is in sensor size. The sensor is the part of the camera that captures the light after it goes through the lens and captures the actual image. And in a lot of ways, you want this to be as big as possible. Some of the benefits of having a larger sensor is you get that background blur. And that's been something that a lot of manufacturers of smartphones have been trying to replicate recently with kind of those portrait modes. The problem with these portrait modes is it relies on the camera to kind of use an algorithm to try to figure out which parts of the image are further in distance from the camera. And depending on how expensive of a phone you get, it could do a variety of quality of that. And also like the environment that you're in too. A lot of times for me, it ends up just completely ruining the image, because it'll pick a part that's like really close to camera and blur it out, and then something that's really far away it'll keep in focus. And that's something that a regular camera does not do. It is purely based on the distance from the camera. So you're kind of relying on the smartphone to do some sort of analysis of the image. And even when the image is finally done, it tends to have a relatively fake like feeling to it, or sometimes just weird flaws. The second part that kind of also plays into sensor size is pixel size, and that's the individual pixels. So let's say you're trying to take a 48 megapixel picture. There are multiple photo sites on this camera sensor that are meant to take each individual one of those pixels. And each one analyzes and tries to figure out what color that pixel is. The main part where pixel size comes into play is in low light image quality. And so what does that mean? That means the larger the pixel is, the more light that comes in onto that pixel, the more accurate it can determine what the color is, what the brightness level is of that color that's coming in at it. And so bigger is better with photo sites. For example, this GH5S, which is a micro four thirds camera, has 4.6 microns. Now, the best camera on my Samsung camera actually uses 0.8 microns, so significantly smaller file sizes. The best my smartphone has is 0.8 microns, which is about 6 times less light, and so 6 times worse in low light. Even the iPhone 16 Pro Max only has 1.22 microns, which means it lets in about the quarter of the light that this camera does. And so that means it will have 1/4 the low light quality that this camera does. Another thing to take in mind is zoom lenses. Now, zoom lenses zoom in, obviously, as the phrase says. Another aspect to think about is a zoom lens. And the way that you zoom in optically is by moving the front lens element further away from the sensor, typically. And one of the ways that early smartphones did this was they just ignored trying to optically zoom, and they just zoomed using what's called a digital zoom, which is where you just crop in further and further into the picture. And you might have noticed this on like an older smartphone where you kind of like, you try to zoom in and it just gets blurrier and blurrier and blurrier, and the pixel quality just really degrades by the time you're zoomed in. Some newer ones and more high-end cameras will either have a dedicated zoomed camera, and so they kind of have like a telephoto lens and a completely different image sensor for that zoom lens. Now, one of the problems with this is that in order to keep it really close in on the camera on the smartphone, they use a smaller image sensor, so that way they can keep the telephoto lens smaller. Whereas if they had a larger sensor, they would need a larger telephoto lens, which would extrude further out from the camera. Then you'd have this huge bump on the back of your smartphone, which wouldn't be very convenient to carry around just as a smartphone. One way some of the higher end cameras use to get around this is they put the zoom lens, they put an optical zoom lens in, and they do it sideways with two mirrors, so that way they can kind of just have it sideways along the side of the phone, and then it beams the light down through. One of the problems with this is the lens can no longer be thicker than the thickness of the smartphone. And so if you want a really thin smartphone, the problem with this is that you can't get a thinner smartphone while having the same zoom lens. And one of the things that determines the thickness of a lens is the aperture. And the aperture determines how much light the lens lets in. And so the thicker the lens is, the more light the lens lets in. And so if you want a zoom lens that lets in lots of light, you're going to need a very thick and large zoom lens. And that's one of the biggest issues with smartphones, is you can't zoom in, let in a lot of light, get really good low light performance, because you're going to need that smaller sensor to keep the zoom lens smaller. You're going to need a small aperture to keep that zoom lens smaller, and you're not going to want it to protrude out from the side or be thicker than the width of the smartphone. And so when it comes to zoom lenses, smartphones really, really struggle. One thing that smartphones do okay at is kind of that wider focal length, kind of middle of the road focal length, where you maybe have a slightly larger sensor, kind of maybe a little bit smaller than a 1-inch sensor, and then just a relatively wider aperture. And one thing to note about aperture is that the bigger the sensor size is, the bigger that lens needs to be to retain that same aperture. And so, for example, a 5.6 aperture lens on full frame will probably be about the same size as a 2.8 aperture on a micro four thirds lens camera system. When it comes to sizes of camera lenses based on the aperture, it's important to know that if you want to let in a lot of light, you need something that's bigger. And if you want a large sensor size, you need a bigger lens. And so obviously, as you scale up in size and all of these elements, everything has to get bigger. So the moral of the story is smartphones can't physically be as good as a dedicated photo or video camera because they are too small. They're too small to take a good picture. And that's just the truth of it. There's certain things that they can specialize in to create better images. They can use some tricks to try to negate some smaller issues with that. For example, they can try and do those fake blurs. They can try to digitally enhance an image. But at the end of the day, it's not a real image at that point either. So yeah, the only way for smartphones to actually improve on their image quality is to kind of just fake making images. And so if you want to create great images, you're going to have to pick up just a camera. And as some of these older cameras are actually available used, even up to like 10 years old, are still actually pretty decent cameras when it comes down to it, just because they're a little bit larger than a smartphone. They actually have a lot of those benefits. They have better low light because the pixel sizes are bigger, the sensor sizes are bigger, the aperture's wider, you can get zoom lenses that have that let in more light, and all of these aspects just combine together to create better photos with those dedicated cameras.